In this video, we're going to be looking at 4 different types of UV curing materials to see whether or not we can use them in our model making projects. We're going to start by looking at Greenstuff World's UV resin. As I pour it out, you can see that it's completely transparent, making it perfectly suitable for making water effects and the like. When I spread it around, it spreads pretty much like a syrup, so it's not too thin, but it will also flow. Next up, we have UV curing putty from Tamiya. As I squeeze it out of the container, you can see that it's a dark yellow in color. This isn't nearly as transparent as the previous, so when we try and get the light to cure it, it may not penetrate as well through a thicker piece. It's very sticky and does not spread nearly as easily. This means that it's going to hold its spot a lot better as well. Next up, we have UV curing putty from Madworks. This one really is a putty. As you can see, I can manipulate it with my hands. It's not too sticky and it's very sculptable. This means I don't have to use as much and I can place it exactly where I want it. The last material we're going to look at isn't actually designed for model making use. This is resin for a resin 3D printer, but it still cures the same way, so we're going to see if it can also be used for model making. The consistency of it is about the same as water. This makes it far more liquidy than the Greenstuff World resin, which was more like a syrup. We're going to cure all 4 of the samples by exposing them to the UV light from this flashlight. When I touch it with my hand, it feels a little bit greasy, but this will wipe off or it can be sanded off. In terms of hardness after curing, I'd say each material is about the same. They're all pretty rigid and hard. The putty from Madworks is also quite hard, and the straight UV resin has cured just like the others did. Next, I'm going to see how easily they come off the surface. The Greenstuff World resin, it stuck pretty well, but we can still pry it off with a little bit of effort. The UV putty by Tamiya doesn't really stick very well at all. Looks like the reason for this is that it didn't cure fully through. It must have been a little bit too thick, and the color is a little bit too solid, so light doesn't penetrate it well. Wow, the Madworks putty didn't stick at all. The UV printer resin was similar to the Tamiya resin. The light didn't really penetrate it very well, so it didn't stick. I'm thinking that if we were using a perfectly clear one, that we'd have much different results. I've drilled some partial holes into this piece in order to test how well these materials work for gap filling. The Greenstuff World liquid fills in the gap really nicely, but it ends up with a bit of a dome because of the surface tension in the material, so we're going to have to sand that back a little bit later. The Tamiya putty is a bit too sticky, which makes it hard to apply. It wants to stick onto my tool rather than into the hole. So I have to apply a bit more and try and spread it out. The Madworks putty, being a putty, is much easier to apply. We just have to take a little bit out with our tool and squish it into the hole. The trick again is getting it to stick. However, if we wet our tool, it would probably be a lot easier to work with, and it's not like the water is going to affect the putty at all. I'm just going to try and remove any excess so that I'm not wasting any extra material. It's not too hard to do with the putty. I just have to make sure that it's really squished into the hole nicely, so there's no air bubbles or anything that are going to affect the finish when I sand it back down. Last, we have the 3D printing resin. This is really liquidy, so it's easy to fill the hole. However, we're also getting a lot of bubbles, and we don't want to have the bubbles come through when we try and sand it back down. We expose the resin and putty to the UV light again in order to harden everything up so that we can sand it. With a toothpick, I just check to make sure that everything has indeed cured before I start. I start with a diamond file in order to take more material off quickly because some of the resins were built up pretty heavily. I then move on to a sandpaper and wet sand it back down to the plastic before checking to see if everything is sanded nice and smooth and flush. Unfortunately, the resin for the 3D printer didn't stick in the hole and came out during the sanding process. I decided to give the 3D printer resin a second try and applied more into the hole so that I could see how it would hold up to drilling. I'm going to use a small drill bit to drill a hole into each of the sections that I've cured to see how well each material handles the drill bit and whether or not it comes up in chunks or whether the holes are nice, clean, and smooth. The hole in the Greenstuff World UV resin is absolutely perfect, held up beautifully, no chunks came up at all. Same thing goes for the UV resin from Tamiya, again another great hole. The Madworks putty, despite coming up off of the card, has held perfectly into the hole that we've drilled here in this piece. And the hole, it filled in a little bit, but I think it's a pretty clean one again. The printer resin also drilled perfectly well. I was actually a bit surprised at this one because we had some issues with it in the past, but that hole looks perfect to me. You can see each of the holes better here. The last test is going to be seeing whether or not we can cast a part in the silicone mold that I made. First up is the Greenstuff World UV resin. This I know is marketed as being able to cast with, so I'm expecting it to have great results. I just pour it into the mold and it fills it up perfectly. I don't have to worry too much about bubbles. The putty from Tamiya, it's too sticky and too thick to really fill the mold properly, so I'm not confident that it's going to get to the bottom and really get me a solid part. Plus we had the issues with not being able to shine the light through a thicker piece, and I think that's going to come up again. There's no sense testing the Madworks putty for this, it's simply not designed for this kind of an application. The UV resin for the 3D printer, however, because it's so liquidy, may fill the mold nicely. However, given that it wouldn't solidify before when it was too thick, I'm going to try using 2 steps to do it this time, and apply it first just to fill the bottom, solidify it, and then again try on the top to see whether or not we have a better result. I'm just going to check to make sure each of these is hardened nicely. Looks like they're good, so I'm going to try pulling them out of the mold and see what kind of result we get. The first one, it's a little tricky to get out, but the part that we got from it looks absolutely beautiful. It's a little hard to see because it's perfectly transparent, but it's a solid piece and it looks like it's cured everything beautifully. I'm really happy with this result. I've got a perfect copy of the original piece now that I've pulled from this mold. Next, we'll see whether or not we get anything usable out of the Tamiya putty. I'm not really optimistic. No, nothing good here. It didn't cure solidly through everything, and I don't really think it filled the mold very well to begin with. So, Tamiya putty, not going to work for using it in a mold. Now we know that when it's really thick, that the UV printer resin will not cure fully, so we'll see whether or not the 2 stages helped. Now, taking a look at this piece, it has some definition, but clearly the resin didn't fill the mold properly, so the results aren't great. I think with a more transparent resin, we would get better results, so maybe that's something I'll test in the future. Let me know in the comments if there's any other materials or tools you'd like me to test, and I'll see you in the next video.